There's no way around it, combat is a huge part of 5e Dungeons & Dragons. And that's also the reason why it's hugely important what kind of creatures we use when we run combat. And that's what I'll be going over in this video, as I'll explain how I think about monster design and show some examples of how we can take boring or less interesting monsters from the 5th edition monster manual, give them new features and abilities and enhance them without actually making them too much more powerful, just making them more fun and challenging for your players to encounter. Alright, so in this video I want to talk about how we can create the most exciting monsters for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. This is a video that was requested by the patrons over at patreon.com/Eventyr when I put out a poll asking which videos people would like to see. And it's also a video that I'm very happy to do because creating fun and exciting monsters and also taking existing monsters and making them more dynamic and enhancing them is one of my great passions. It's what I spend a lot of time doing as we put out monsters on the Patreon and also for the adventures and other stuff that we are publishing. So the issue you'll often run into when running 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons is that a lot of the monsters, especially the monsters in the monster manual and earlier books, are not very interesting. It's quite clear that the designers were very happy to move away from 4th edition's complexity and diversity of options and into something that is far more simple and easy to run. And while this was probably not as noticeable in the start of 5th edition, it's becoming more and more clear that a lot of the monsters in the monster manual are not very interesting. So what makes a good monster? In my opinion, it boils down to a few things. These sort of overlap and can be combined, but there's a few points that I think it's necessary for you to think about if you're trying to create a great monster. First off, we want monsters with diverse combat options. We then also want those combat options to target different defenses, and we also want combat options that can alter the combat, that can tactically challenge the players and their characters. Lastly, we also want the monsters to not be too simple and not overly complex. The first point basically boils down to what can the monster do on its turn in combat. If you flip through the monster manual, you'll notice that a lot of the monsters are, when you boil it down, essentially the same creature. It has hit points, it has an AC, and it has a move speed, and then it has an attack, and if it's really lucky, it also has a ranged attack. Beyond that, it's the same creature. You can take away the artwork, you can take away whether it's a Morning Star or Short Sword. In essence, a Frost Giant is the same creature as a Fire Giant, and a Fire Giant is the same creature as an Ogre, and so on, because all these creatures do is that they hit you or they throw stuff at you, and they have hit points and they have AC. There's not much to it. To use an example, it's the difference between an invisible stalker, which is an incredibly boring creature that has AC hit points. It's really hard to hit, but it has a single attack that doesn't deal a lot of damage. So you'll be standing there using 5-10 rounds, depending on the party's level, striking down this invisible creature that deals like 10 damage each round, and that's about it. Compared to a creature of a similar challenge rating, the Rock, which is a demon that can stun you, and it can create spores, and it can strike you, and it simply has more options to use in combat, and that makes for more tactically challenging and dynamic combat. But that's not all there is to diversity of combat options. There's also this thing about hitting different defenses. This is something that is very often overlooked also in the official rules. If we look at the Rock, you can see that it really only targets the character's AC and its Constitution saving throw. So if you have a character with a high AC and proficiency in Constitution, which is basically any melee character, then the Rock really isn't much of a threat. If we compare the Rock's options to that of the Mage, which again has the same challenge rating, we can see that the Mage with its spells can target the character's Constitution, Dexterity, Wisdom, and that's even without changing its spell list. So while the Rock does have more dynamic options than something like the Invisible Stalker, it's still not as dynamic as it could be because its abilities all target the same defenses. Then there's also the point about combat abilities that actually change the combat. As you'll notice, a lot of these extra abilities that creatures have, Dragon's Fire Breath for example, it really still only deals damage. And you can have a creature that can attack you from range, it can attack you from melee, it can hit you with its tail, it can breathe fire on you, it can make flyby attacks and stuff like that. But if everything it does boils down to dealing damage to the characters, then it's not really going to change the combat unless the characters have low hit points. In a deadly encounter, that's probably fine, or it can be fine because the threat of going to 0 hit points is always there. But in encounters that aren't directly deathly, this really takes the tension out of the encounter. So to create that tension in the encounter, even if it's not a deadly one, we want the monsters to have abilities that affect the battlefield and force the characters to change their tactics. It could be incapacitating the characters or hampering them in some way, summoning new creatures or bolstering itself or allies, something that makes it more than just a running battle of hit points versus damage. A good example of this is the Grig Alpha, which is a cool concept, but which again boils down to having hit points and dealing damage with one of its 3 attacks. If we compare that to the Mind Flayer, which again has the same challenge rating as the Grig Alpha, we get a monster that is a much more diverse enemy because it can stun you, it can use its tentacles to eat your brain, it has spells like Dominate Monster, so it can target a lot of different saving throws and also put characters into an incapacitated state without first reducing them to 0 hit points. This is something that keeps the characters on their toes and keeps tension high in the encounter. As you probably noticed, a lot of the stuff that I've suggested so far is stuff that'll make the monster more complex and also difficult to run. Giving monsters more combat options and more diverse combat options is of course going to add a layer of complexity to the monster. If you have 10 goblins in an encounter, you don't want each of them to have 4 different combat options that are viable in different situations and maybe recharges or have single uses and stuff like that, so you have a lot of stuff to keep track on. You want to keep your minions simple and time efficient so you can quickly decide, okay, this monster is going to do this thing or that thing and then move on. But if you have a boss monster or a solitary monster, it's okay for them to be a lot more complex. Basically what we want to do here is that we want to create monsters that are dynamic and tactically challenging while also keeping them as simple as possible. This can seem quite obvious, but it's actually an error that I often see people make, and I've made myself for that matter, that we try to create fun monsters, but we end up with very difficult to run monsters that have a lot of abilities and requires the DM to sit down and spend half an hour reading through a stat block to understand what's going on. We want to strike that balance where we get fun monsters, not complex or overly complex monsters. I personally learn stuff like this best if I can get an example, so that's what I'll be doing now. Taking a monster from the monster manual and trying to apply the things that I've suggested so far to create a more fun and dynamic monster. The monster that I want to start out with is the Ogre, which, as I've mentioned previously, is a quite one-dimensional monster. It has hit points, it has AC, and it has a melee attack, and it has a ranged attack. Looking at the Ogre, there's some stuff that I feel we can do to improve how it plays in combat. The first thing we can do is that we can give it a throw option. It can try to grapple a character. If it succeeds, it can then throw that character, which has to make a dexterity saving throw. If it fails, it takes damage, lands prone, and may even be tossed into one of its allies, also knocking that creature prone and dealing it damage. While this option is often not as good as just hitting something with the Great Club, it can be used in situations where the Ogre wants to hit 2 characters at once. It wants to move a character out of the way. It wants to throw someone down a hole, over a river, or what have you. It also gives the Ogre an option to target something the character may not be as good as just having a high AC. The wizard that is constantly using shield to defend itself from the Ogre will have a harder time escaping it when the Ogre tries to grab that wizard and simply throw it down into a chasm. Secondly, we can also give the Ogre a trample action. It can move its move speed in a direction, trampling over medium or smaller creatures in its path. They may be knocked prone and the Ogre may end up in a better spot. Again, this is not an action the Ogre is going to want to use all the time because it's probably inferior to hitting people with a Great Club most of the time, but it can be used if you want to reposition the Ogre, if you want to hit multiple enemies at a time. So yeah, with just these 2 options, we get an Ogre that is not a better combatant necessarily. Of course, versatility is a strength on its own, but at least a more dynamic and challenging combatant that can do different stuff, that can tactically challenge the characters and change how the combat is going. As another example, I'll take a look at the Dragon, which of course is the quintessential foe of Dungeons and Dragons. In previous editions we had dragons that were spellcasters and could do a lot of cool different stuff. In 5e, dragons are non-spellcasters, at least the dragons in the core rulebooks, and they don't really have that many diverse options when you boil it down. Most of their stuff is about dealing damage. That's especially true for, let's say, a young dragon, which has just attacks and a breath weapon that deals damage. The problem isn't as big for adult and ancient dragons because they get legendary actions and possibly lair actions. The wing attack action is a good example of an AoE that can also change the battlefield and give the dragon mobility. It's a really cool action in my opinion. And then you have of course some lair actions for some dragons that allow them to change the battlefield. But turning it back a bit, let's take a look at the young dragon, which is probably the dragon you're most likely to face in most campaigns, since we know that campaigns usually tend to run from 1st to 7th level. So I think that's a good example to begin with, because if you're just heading up against a lone young green dragon as a party, it really only does one thing. It tries to hit you with its claws and its bite, and when available it uses its breath weapon. That's all it can do. It can of course try to fly away, come back and make some flyby attacks and stuff like that. That can be tactically challenging, and that's also what I would suggest that you do if you run it. But on its own, it's not like it has abilities that really foster that kind of combat. Alright, so how can we improve the young green dragon without making it a lot stronger? First off, we can give it the wing attack that is available to adult and ancient dragons. This can just be an action it can take instead of making its melee attacks. It's not the best action to take in most cases, but if the dragon is surrounded by 2, 3 or even 4 enemies, using its wings to buffet them all, giving some damage, perhaps knocking them prone, and also maybe flying away if it wants to, can be a viable option as opposed to just striking at a single foe or using its disengage to get out of the situation. Another thing we can do is that we can take a page from the metallic dragons, which have dual breath attacks. They have 2 different options. That's something that I feel is really cool, where you have one breath attack if you just want to deal damage, and that's sometimes what you want to do, and you have a breath attack that can do some other stuff. In the green dragon's case, we can create a thematic option, the hallucinogenic, that's a hard one, breath weapon, which deals psychic damage, targets the wisdom saving throw as opposed to the constitution saving throw, and which can also leave its enemies incapacitated. So if the dragon is not winning the combat, it's in a tough spot, it knows the character still has a lot of hit points, using that breath weapon to try and incapacitate its enemies before then flying away, for example, is a better option than using its normal, more damaging attack. Finally, we can make the young green dragon even more dynamic and a more interesting foe by also giving it spellcasting. As I mentioned, casting spells is something that dragons traditionally could do in previous editions, and something that I feel is quite thematically fitting for dragon. Here we run into another thing that's sort of a pet peeve of mine with the way monsters are designed in 5th edition. What you'll often see in the books is that monsters have character levels, or at least appear to do. They have spell slots like a character, and they cast spells from a specific character class's spell list. For me, that's a weird mix of character classes and monsters that I don't think is necessary, and it overcomplicates spellcasting. Of course, some creatures do have innate spellcasting, which is also what I vastly prefer. Basically, you don't want to give the monster a lot of spells that is not usable in combat. You don't need to list that it has scrying. That's something you can write in the adventure, just decide in your head. As a DM, when running the monster, we only really want to know which spells does it have and which spells are good. You don't have to list all the C tier, D tier spells that it's never going to use when it only has 3 to 5 rounds in a combat before it's eventually killed. So we're just going to give the young green dragon 3 spells. We'll give it Fog Cloud and Ray of Sickness, which are spammable. They are at will and they are very situational. Fog Cloud can set up an escape or an ambush. We also have to remember that the dragon has blind sight, so throwing out a Fog Cloud is probably a good idea because it'll give it a great advantage over the characters. Then there's Ray of Sickness. It's not really a good option for the dragon. It can deal a lot more damage with its bite and claws, but if it wants to stay at range and attack, this is a very good option as opposed to not doing anything, of course. Lastly, we'll also give it Enemies Abound, which is a spell from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, which I think is really thematically fitting for the green dragon. It turns a character against another character without being as strong as a dominate person spell, for example. So with these 3 spells, we give the dragon some options that are not necessarily better than the options it already has, but that can target different saving throws for the characters, that can set up different scenarios and challenge the characters in different ways to make it a more tactically challenging and enjoyable enemy. And that's basically the point of the whole video. We don't necessarily want monsters that are stronger or last longer or can hit harder. What we want to do is to create monsters that are fun and entertaining to play against, that put the characters in tactical challenging situation. If the dragon casts fog cloud, that challenges the wizard to figure out which of its spells can maybe dispel or disperse the fog, and if the dragon is surrounded by enemies, it can use its wing attack, just as its breath attack sort of forces the characters to think about their positioning on the battlefield. So to summarize the overall point that I'm trying to make here, we want to make combat encounters that are tense, that have consequences. We want them to be tactically challenging, and we also want them to be time efficient. And that means creating monsters that have diverse combat options, that can target different defenses, and that can alter the combat without just dealing damage. And lastly, that are not too complex or too simple for what we're trying to do. So yeah, I hope that you got something out of this video. If you want more examples of monster design, let me know. I can make videos on more specific stuff if that's something you're interested in, or we can try and cook up some different examples. I could even do a run through of how I'm designing a monster for our weekly patron encounter. And you can of course also sign up to the Patreon if you want to get your hands on those monsters, maps, magic items, tokens, item card handouts, and everything else that we're putting out on a weekly basis over there. So yeah, that's it for me for this one, and I hope that I'll see you in the next video.